Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Good morning for those of you who are on the other side of the ocean in a different time zone. So, welcome to this webinar on the employment of persons with disabilities in the public sector. I'm Stefan. I'm the senior disability specialist in the International Labour Organization, and we're very excited to host this webinar with very distinguished speakers, which I will introduce in a moment. Let me just give you a very quick background information, which I think would be interesting for many of you. The ILO provides a secretariat to the so-called ILO Global Business and Disability Network. And we organized a major conference, and some of you were at that conference back in November last year, under the title, Making the Future of Work Inclusive of Persons with Disabilities. We had a number of very interesting sessions, and one of the sessions was particularly interesting and was focused on the employment of persons with disabilities in the public sector, an issue that we had, at least on our side of the ILO, we had not paid enough attention. So we're very happy to have that session. And two of the three speakers who are joining us today were panelists in that session. And I think I'm not disclosing any huge secret, but it's fair to say that under the leadership of the Canadian Deputy Minister, who will be our first speaker, and with the support from the New York Commissioner on Persons with Disabilities, we are jointly discussing the idea of establishing some form of network that would bring together public sector entities committed to the employment of persons with disabilities. And we will be keeping you informed about that in the near future. So without further ado, let me introduce the three speakers. So first we have, and you have all received in the reminder and the information about the webinar, you have a more detailed bio of the three of them, so I won't go into the details of that. We're having, first speaker is Yazmine Laroche, who is the Deputy Minister on Public Service Accessibility of Canada since 2018. So welcome, Yazmine. She will be the first speaker. Yazmine will be followed by a double act from New York City. First, Victor Calise as Commissioner of New York City Mayor's Office for Persons with Disabilities, and who is accompanied by the Assistant Commissioner, Martha Jackson. So just a bit of a housekeeping. You will be able to send questions to the speakers through the Q&A box that you should have at the bottom of your screen. So please use that, because we will not be able to put questions orally, so it has to go through the chat box, the Q&A box. I will be filtering and I will be bringing those questions to the speakers as soon as they have finished. We're also going to record the session, and we're going to send the recording out to all of you after the session. We had 180 people have initially registered for the seminar, for the webinar. We saw at this stage we have around 50 people actually joining. I hope that a few more will be joining in the next couple of minutes. So without further ado, if that's okay, I will pass the floor to the Deputy Minister of Canada, Yazmine Laroche. Yazmine, over to you.
Thank you very much, Esteban, and hi to everybody. It's wonderful to see you, and I hope from my end, it looks like I might have lost the connection. I hope that you can still hear and see me. Wave if you can. Victor, that's great. Thank you. Esteban, first of all, I just wanted to thank you and the ILO for your leadership in making this happen. It's a tremendous opportunity for us to start to build some awareness, but also to share experiences around how do we identify, how do we remove, and how do we prevent barriers to accessibility and the broader inclusion of people with disabilities in our society, and of course, from my perspective, in the workforce in particular. So we're the public sector, and we like to say that we have a different bottom line. Our bottom line is the public interest. And so we think that we're kind of uniquely positioned to pioneer some initiatives, and we hope to learn from our colleagues in the private sector. In Canada, we hope to become a bit of a role model. So this forum, we think, is a wonderful opportunity. Let me start about talking about the business case. So in Canada, in our context, we think that the business case for the inclusion of people with disabilities in the workplace it's just never been stronger. Our unemployment rate is really low by historical standards, and our population is aging. And so we know that we have a big challenge in the public sector. We're the biggest employer in the country, and we have an obligation to find and retain talent. And there is a huge untapped pool of talent ready to work in this country. In Canada, people with disabilities between 25 and 64, we identified in our most recent survey on disability, there were 645,000 individuals with disabilities who are not currently in the workforce, but have the education, the skills, and the desire to work. And so we understand that as the Government of Canada, as the public service, as the largest employer in the country, we need to do something about that. And we got a challenge thrown to us by our government. When they introduced our new Accessible Canada legislation, they said we were going to hire 5,000 new people with disabilities into the Canadian Public Service by 2025. Now, when you consider that today there's approximately 12,000 employees who self-identify as living with a disability in the federal public service, you can appreciate that we have a bit of a way to go to realize this goal. But we know that as a public service, we actually haven't taken full advantage of the opportunity to recruit and retain and promote employees with disabilities. Our representation rate over the last 10 years is actually declining. So the high was about 6%, and we're now down to 5.2% in terms of representation. And yet we know that the number of people with disabilities who could work has more than doubled over that same period. Our recruitment rate is half of our separation rate. So annually, we hire about 3%. 3% of our total hires are people with disabilities. Our exit rate is double that. Career advancement is also stagnating for people with disabilities. We've done a wave of surveys of our employees to study promotion rates. And what we've learned is that people with disabilities in the Canadian Public Service have the lowest promotion rates of anybody else in the Canadian Public Service. So these numbers tell us that there are lots of barriers that still exist to the participation of people with disabilities in the Canadian Public Service. We did a huge round of consultations in the lead up to developing our public service accessibility strategy. And we learned, in trying to understand what's behind some of these numbers, what we learned was that workplace accommodations is perhaps the biggest pain point. Employees have to wait a long time before they get the accommodations and adjustments that they need. They have to relitigate every time they change jobs. They are constantly being asked to provide medical certificates and proof of their disability. And so it's no wonder then when you look at our engagement surveys that people with disabilities also report the highest levels of harassment and discrimination. In fact, 20% higher than for the median in the public service. So we know that when it comes to employment, we need a multifaceted approach. First, we obviously need to do a better job of hiring people with disabilities. But secondly, we need a more concerted effort to support them throughout their careers if we really want to support them to contribute to their maximum. And we need to be getting rid of the barriers that are stopping people from advancing in their careers. So let me tell you a little bit about what we're doing right now in Canada. The government introduced the first federal legislation on accessibility, and it came into effect in July of 2019. And it, for the first time, allows the federal government to set standards and regulate in 7 key areas of under federal authority. So that includes the built environment, it includes transportation, it includes information and communications technology, it includes program and service design and delivery, and perhaps mostly of interest to this group today, it also includes employment. And it also mandates that all of what we call the federally regulated entities report on their progress by preparing and publishing an accessibility plan, a multi-year accessibility plan. And these plans have to show how we involved people with lived experience in developing those plans and how they will be involved in monitoring the implementation of those plans. When the government tabled the legislation, they said, oh, and by the way, Canadian Federal Public Service, you're going to lead the way. You're going to become the poster child for accessibility and inclusion, which is why my job was created and why my organization was created to develop the roadmap for the Canadian Public Service. Our accessibility strategy, which we've called Nothing Without Us, was officially launched on May the 27th last year. And it focuses on 5 goals. And these 5 goals came out of some really extensive consultations that we did. We interviewed over 12,000 people, public servants across the country. And it was through those consultations that we came up with our goals. The first one is improving the recruitment, the retention, and the promotion of people with disabilities. The second is about making our built environment accessible. The third is about making our information and communications technology usable by everybody. The fourth is helping public servants to be better at designing and delivering accessible policies and programs. And finally, and the biggest piece, and sort of underpins everything, is building what we call an accessibility confident culture in the public service. All of these goals reinforce one another. You can focus on employment, but if you're not fixing the built environment, if you're not fixing your information communications technology, then people are going to leave because they're not getting the best work experience that they could be. And when you've got a race for talent and you've got an aging population and a shrinking labor force, there is a big race for talent going on. So we need to be competitive. Now, coming back to employment, everything starts with the recruitment process. You need to make sure that there are no barriers in your recruitment process. What we found when we did our consultations was that managers and HR professionals didn't always feel equipped to deal with accessibility needs. So we have something called the Public Service Commission in the Canadian Public Service, and they have a specialized recruitment center and an assessment center. And what they've done is they have put a particular focus on making sure that we're developing barrier-free recruitment processes and that we're making it easier for people when they self-identify, when they're applying for a job, that they're going to get an assessment and a recruitment process that actually works for them. They've also created something that they call the Assessment Accessibility Ambassadors Network. And it's a group of HR professionals who are developing an expertise in accessibility around assessment and recruitment. And so it's like a network so that they can help each other and learn from each other. Okay, so once you've gotten through the recruitment process and you've been hired, what do you need to be able to thrive? What we've done is we've created something called the Centralized Enabling Workplace Fund. So we got some funding in the last federal budget. And what we're doing is we're investing in pilot projects in different government organizations. And these pilot projects are designed to test different ways to remove barriers in the workplace. And so our criteria for investing are pretty straightforward. You have to have identified a barrier. You have to come up with an approach to removing it. And it needs to be scalable and replicable because we're all about scaling up and being able to leverage what we're learning. And we've already got some really interesting initiatives in the pipeline. The first one, and I think this is huge, it's called a Workplace Accessibility Passport. And the passport, it's a really simple tool. Right now, we're just using, we've got a basic Word document. And what it does, it facilitates a conversation between the employee and their manager. And it's not about what's wrong with you, tell me your medical condition. It's about what are the barriers that you currently encounter in the workplace and what can we do to eliminate those barriers. And it becomes, in effect, a contract between the employer and the employee, and it accompanies the employee throughout their career. because the principle behind it is tell us once. So you tell your hiring manager, this is what I need. It's a contract and it goes with you, and your accommodations will follow you throughout your career. Our hope is that this is going to, first of all, improve the turnaround time in terms of people getting access to what they need. But secondly, that it will also facilitate much easier mobility and career progression. We're also creating a centralized lending library of the most commonly requested adaptive devices and technologies. And this is particularly to meet the needs of people who are hired on short-term assignments. So we have a summer student program, and we want to bring in a lot more students with disabilities. Rather than putting them through the conventional accommodations process, they would have access to this lending library for the duration of their term. And our colleagues who are running this program are actually developing a showroom so people can actually go in and test and experiment with the devices that are in the lending library. I mentioned some of the things that we're doing around hiring. I mentioned the federal summer student program for students with disabilities. We're also launching a federal internship program, and this is designed to create 2-year placements for people with disabilities who want to come and work for the Government of Canada. And it gives them a position for 2 years that's partially subsidized by our Public Service Commission, but it also provides support to both the employee and to the welcoming manager, so that, again, to try and eliminate some of the barriers. The third thing that we're doing, and I'm very pleased with this initiative, we've partnered with an agency called Live, Work, Play, and they specialize in placing individuals with intellectual and cognitive disabilities. And we know that these individuals have the biggest challenge in terms of getting decent paying jobs in the workplace. To date, after 2 years of collaboration with the organization, we've hired our 100th employee in the federal public service. And we're really, really proud of that, because these are people who are bringing a lot to the workplace. And it requires a more targeted and dedicated effort to ensure success, but we're really, really proud of it. I mentioned the government set a target of hiring 5,000 new employees. So we are actually working with, there are approximately 200 different organizations within the federal public service. And we are working with them to determine what kind of targets should they be setting within their own organizations. So these are that's just an example of some of the initiatives that are underway. There's a lot more to come. It's a really exciting time to be working in the accessibility space in the federal government and in Canada. We really feel that there's momentum. We've just launched an informal network with some of the largest private sector firms in the country, so that we can again learn from each other. For me, I don't want to be reinventing the wheel. I want to steal from the best. I want to learn from the best. I want to know who's doing what around the world. And again, I'm just so thrilled to be able to share some of our experience in Canada with you, but I'm really looking forward to learning. We've already learned a lot from Victor's example in New York, and we're keen to learn more from others who are participating. So once again, thank you to Stefan and the ILO for taking this on, and I'll be delighted to answer any questions if there's a question period later. Thank you.
Thank you, Yazmine. You were already one of the highlights of our conference back in November, and you have reaffirmed your amazing knowledge on this issue. There's a lot of things that I would like to steal as ILO from you, and I'm sure, and there are a number of other colleagues from UN entities also in the webinar. As you know, there is now a UN disability inclusion strategy, which has one of the key areas is employment, and we can definitely learn a lot from what you're doing, and we can learn a lot from each other, but definitely a lot of things that we can steal from you. You've put the bar again very high, so colleagues in New York, don't feel challenged, but over to you. Try to do to that. And without further ado, you should, Victor and Martha, you should have in your screen, you should have a possibility of clicking on a share screen button. If you do so, you will be on control of the PowerPoint, and I'm unmuting you right now.
Hello, everyone. How are you? Yazmine, excellent presentation. I just did enjoy everything that you are doing and how you're pushing the needle forward. I love your passport ideas. I love your apprenticeship ideas. So, well, we're going to borrow from that lightly. I'll be sure to give you credit on that. But thank you, Stefan, for putting this together. Thank you for having us part of this international conversation to be able to show the great work that we're doing here. But as Yazmine said, the ability to learn from others and gather information so we could make work around the world accessible for everyone. I don't see our presentation up. I don't.
You should have a button that says share.
Okay, I see it.
And then through that, you should be able, if you have your presentation on your computer, you should be able to connect with that. If not, we can take it from here.
Yeah, if you can take it from there, because I didn't load it up on my computer. I see what you mean. That's where I failed to do that. Thank you.
Okay, then Jürgen, can you take that over? Yeah, so that's happening now.
Perfect. Thanks so much. There we go. So New York City, we're home to 8 million people. Of those 8 million people, about 1 million of them are people with disabilities. And we have about 9 million people with disabilities that come and visit the city every year. And we're one of the oldest cities in America. And we have our challenges as far as accessibility is concerned. Next slide. So we want to make sure that we hold New York City accountable for what they do. So we came up with a comprehensive plan. Oh, we can go back to that one. Called the Accessible NYC, and it's a state of persons with disabilities in New York City. And it touches on 8 areas. Transportation, how do we improve our existing infrastructure that we have now with accessible taxis and new emerging transportation like micro transportation? How do we make sure that housing is accessible and affordable for people with disabilities? How do we have access to healthcare and effective communication for people who are deaf and hard of hearing in that healthcare system? How do we ensure that our education is transitioning kids from high school into the workplace and into college appropriately? Employment is our big thing, which we're going to get to. Financial empowerment, how do we make sure people are financially empowered so they can get health, they can get the housing, and they can get that transportation? And of course, digital accessibility, because the way the world is moving, it's more of a digital platform than it is ever before. And how do we ensure that our cities are smart, that our websites are accessible, and we have access to every city service? Next slide.
So this is Martha Jackson, and again, thank you for allowing me to participate. I think it's really important to know the landscape of people with disabilities in New York as it relates to their employment. And a staggering 79% of New Yorkers with disabilities are not in the labor force. That's 79%. The reality is that ages 16 to 64 and older, that's the 79%. And for those who are 18 and older, 65% of those individuals are unemployed. You know, I think everybody knows that unemployment in the country is doing quite well, especially in New York City. We're hovering around 4% or slightly lower for people without disabilities. So we have a big challenge ahead of us. Next slide, please.
So we came up with an idea of a public-private partnership to employ people with disabilities in New York City. It really is looking across supply and demand sides, and we really understood that where are the jobs, and that this really needs to be business-led and business-driven. Because generally it would be a bunch of people with disabilities sitting around a room with service providers saying, where are the jobs? And we've always been absent of business. So we really wanted to make sure that businesses were part of this process. And we worked across service providers of vocational rehab, schools, colleges, and really in the high growth sectors. And New York City and our government employs 400,000 people. That's just in New York City alone. So we have an obligation to hire people with disabilities. And want to make sure that we're holding the city accountable. Next slide. So if we look at the structure, there really is businesses at the top because that's where the jobs are. And working with all our service providers, transitioning students, unconnected job seekers, making sure they come, and working with private colleges and city colleges. And as you can see, New York City is uniquely poised right in the middle to be able to move this needle forward and connect businesses with all the service providers.
Next slide. So one of the ways that we began this is we actually started a business development council. The name of our initiative, workforce initiative, is NYC at Work. It took us about 2.5 years to build, to get the commitments, to get the funding from the philanthropic community. And so we started just with 10 businesses. And we asked them, what are the barriers? Why are your challenges so great? And this is what they all told us. Number one, we do not know where to get the talent. Number two, we don't have dedicated staff and resources like we would with other hiring initiatives such as gender or LGBTQ. We don't know very much about disability, reasonable accommodation. Human resources will usually stop this at the door for the previous reasons. And finally, when someone does get a job, often that is the place where they stay. So a lot of the thing that Yazmine mentioned in terms of when someone gets a job, their ability to retain employment and carry on and move up the career ladder, these are issues that I think we are all facing, and we are seriously committed to making change there. So those 10 businesses that came on board about 4 years ago, right now we have over 100 members. Some of them are on the slide, but it's an indication, again, as the commissioner said, across all sectors. Hospitality, transportation, business and finance services, arts and culture are huge here in New York City, healthcare, and of course, technology.
And the city of New York has jobs in all these fields, in our Health and Hospitals Corporation, in our Department of Information, Telecommunications, Technologies, Parks and Recreation, and the list goes on because we have over 50 agencies throughout the city of New York that provide services. Next slide. Martha?
Sure. So one of the ways that we feel it's really important to be able to get employers engaged without a job interview to start is through a variety of partnerships. I think one of the most important things that we do for our business community, whether it is public or private, is we offer a disability etiquette and awareness training before we enter into any kind of partnership. We've reached over 3,000 members of the business community in the past 2 years. That number is consistently growing. It is an in-person training. It's very interactive and fun and honest and truthful, but it is led by members of our staff, those of us with and without disabilities. And it's usually the first time this conversation has ever happened. So creating a safe space to be able to share with people, we know you don't know what you don't know. And if you're ever going to be able to kind of open the door and feel confident and comfortable in creating a positive work experience for anyone, you certainly have to start with what is appropriate and what is acceptable. So we do employer-led workshops. We bring our business folks in to lead all kinds of workshops, from resume to time management, in some cases personal branding, talking about reasonable accommodation, talking about disclosure, helping people with their LinkedIn profile. When it comes from businesses, whether it's the city or not, this is where the dual exposure happens for the first time without, the threat of a job or an interview hanging over someone's head. It's an opportunity for people just to learn and meet each other at a very level playing field. Some of the other ways that we work is we provide career explorations. We do targeted recruitments. We've been very successful with city government in that. We do direct referrals. We offer opportunities for informational interviews for someone who might be transferring from one career to another or is looking to move up. And some members of our business community will take the time to spend an hour or so with a job seeker to really help them figure out what's the right path for them. We're always exploring current and future needs because where are the jobs now, but where are the jobs going to be in a year, 2, and 3? Help us figure that out so we can help prepare the job seekers and the future workforce so that they will have the skills and be prepared. And I think the one that's probably the most relevant to this conversation is that New York City has a program called the 55A program.
Next slide, please. No, it's short.
Okay. So the 55A program, it's been around for a long time. It started in the 70s. It is overseen by the same agency that oversees the civil service examinations. So 55A is actually the name of the law. And one of the things that Commissioner and I wanted to do when we started looking at NYC at Work as a viable opportunity for people to have jobs in city government is to figure out what 55A was. And why was it not working? They have 700 slots, not jobs, but slots that individuals with disabilities, if they have the skill for, they have the opportunity to apply and go for that job without having to take a civil service exam. So this is a way into city government. It's not that you have to stay 55A. We urge individuals, of course, to make sure that they take promotional exams. But what we were able to do, and this was in partnership with the agency that had been overseeing it for years, is we figured out how do we work together. So we had our first ever symposium, 120 agency personnel officers and EEO officers came together to understand really how 55A works. The way that it had worked in the past, they were never able to get over a few hundred folks into the workforce. But it's based on the job. The individual must be qualified to perform the duties of the position with or without accommodation. And of course, they must meet the requirements for the position sought. The process was very clunky in the past. And I think you mentioned this before, Yazmine. A person would have to apply for a position. Then they would have to disclose. Then they would have to get verification of the disability. Then they'd have to go for the reasonable accommodation. It's 9 months later. Who can do that? So one of the things that we were able to do is in partnership, we work with not just the Department of Citywide Administrative Services, the agency that oversees 55A, but we work hand in hand with the state vocational rehabilitation agencies that provide the verification and documentation. So we have been able to create career opportunities. We vet every single job seeker that comes to us. We make sure they have the qualifications for the job. We work with them, making sure their resume matches the job qualifications. They interview for the opportunity. If they're offered the position, we work directly with the state agency to make sure that they're verified as a person with a disability and that they can do the position. So we have been able to streamline this process. What used to take 9 months in some cases has taken 6 weeks. In one case, it took 5 days, but that was an anomaly. I think one of the things that really shows that this process is working is that in 2016 and 2017 each year, 4 individuals were able to enter city government through 55A. So that was 4 each year. Last year, 80 positions were have been filled. We have 72 actually working. 8 individuals declined. There are 8 individuals pending as of January the 1st, and we also have over 10 individuals who came through city government without having to go through 55A. It's having the infrastructure, as Yazmine mentioned, having that infrastructure in place and partnering with your right city agencies to be able to make this change happen.
Great. Next slide. So we have job seeker resources. We provide guidance. We look at how, as Martha talked about, tailoring application materials, guidance for job search. We have a job board, and we submit materials to employers directly. And again, it's us convening everything and making sure that we can connect job seekers to the resources that they actually need. Next slide. Martha, want to talk about the job
Right.
board?
So actually, this is one of the things that we did the first 2 years coming together. We actually created our own job board for NYC at Work. Companies can upload their job postings right on our job board. We have staff that check it a couple of times a day. It's in real time. Those positions are live. And when someone does apply for a position, that information comes to us. It does not go to the employer. Again, we really want to work so hand in hand with both our partners, who are our business partners and who are our job seekers or potential candidates, to make sure that the right match is happening.
And it's really about that match and making sure that we drive, and we have consistency, right? Because a lot of what's happened in the past is everyone just went to a business and they just didn't have the time to deal with that. And it's one focus, one ease, and making sure that across government, because that works so much easier for us to employ everyone through our agencies. Next slide.
And this is the way that referrals can be made. Candidates can come right from the job board. For candidates that meet the full requirements, they just have to complete the referral form. For a job seeker, someone who's looking for opportunities, and they're not to make referrals that are not in connection to jobs on our job board, we also have a general referral form. Next slide.
And it's about talking about our success stories, making sure that we have things out in the media, both in social and print media. So we do this pretty well. You'll see a sign behind us that's talking about employing people, and that sign behind us. That's for people that may or may not be able to see. It's a sign of two people working in a kitchen. And the great part is you don't know who the person with the disability is. And that's it. It's about making sure that people with disabilities are fully integrated into work and they're just part of work.
So again, and I think you're familiar with this in Canada, in response to what business has told us, we learned that there are going to be over 100,000 jobs in technology in New York City within the next 10 years, and we simply do not have the talent. This is a great opportunity for us to meet the demands of the business community, both for city government and for the private sector. So we were able to, in a very short period of time, come together with business, with the State Vocational Rehabilitation Agency, and again, a provider partner. And we created the first Cisco NetAcad that's led for people with disabilities, accessible training for an industry recognized certification. And it was launched really in response to our business's growing demand for IT security professionals. It's called the Ability Academy. Next slide. And the reason that we felt that was, maybe we could go back just for a second to the Ability Academy. We are now in our third cohort. It is a 6-month training program with a 3-month paid internship at the end. The provider agency, which is Institute for Career Development, is a proprietary school. The Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities and NYC at Work were able to help get funding to start the Ability Academy, to get consultants to come in to help us create this. And we also got business sponsorship to make sure that there were funds available for anyone who had a need for an internship that was not going to be paid, or needed to have a second internship that was not necessarily accounted for in the businesses. So we have usually about 16 individuals in the class, fully accessible. We know that of the first two cohorts, 80% have their internships. More than half have passed their certification. And with the third cohort, we are now looking at creating, with this particular cohort, more site visits. We bring the business community and city government into the academy to talk about what individuals need to be able to be successful, the kinds of jobs that are there, and connect them. We also have employer engagement and career diversity fairs at the end of each cohort, connecting them directly to either an internship or an opportunity.
And the great part is that this is across all disabilities. We're cognitive, vision, hearing, mobility. So we're really making sure that we get a diverse cohort of people that come in. And with that, it's about making sure that we have the right classroom environment that's there to be able to teach across all those disabilities in one setting. And we've learned something from the last cohort to the third cohort, which is an evolution, and we get better over time. And we're going to see what other train to place models that we can put together, especially in city government, and making sure that we can get everyone as skilled as possible to be able to push them in the right direction. And people have gotten jobs in the private sector and in city government through this as well.
And Yazmine, you talked about having internships. We're thinking of that as apprenticeships here. We're actually meeting with the head of apprenticeships in New York State. So we are so aligned in so many ways. It's really very thrilling to know that we are so aligned.
And then the last slide is Empowered NYC. And once people are able to get jobs, or even before they get jobs, we want to make sure that they understand what it's like to bank properly, understanding what happens to their benefits once they do work, which is a conundrum here in the States for lots of different reasons, making sure that they get all their payments done, how they can reduce debt, of course, and really start saving and being able to get access into everything this city has to offer. I think we'll stop there. Thank you for giving us the opportunity, and questions, if they're up there, we'll be happy to answer.
Thank you a lot, Victor. Thank you a lot, Martha, for excellent presentation. It's a very comprehensive approach you have, going both into terms of employment within the city, but also the role that you play to promote employment within the city, outside, let's say, you as an employer. Very, very impressive presentation. Thanks a lot. I'm encouraging participants to use the Q&A box. Unless there's a problem with the system, I'm not getting any questions so far. So please do that in the coming minutes. But in the meantime, Yazmine, let me ask you two specific questions. One is one of the big challenges we have also within the UN system is the whole issue around self-identification. I mean, who is a person with disabilities? So if you want to monitor your figures, how do you solve that issue? At least in the UN context, it is complex. And the second issue is about the pipeline. No? I mean, very interesting, all the measures you're taking in terms of getting your own house in order. But I was wondering, have you also planned to sort of reach out and, for instance, do a bit what Victor and Martha were sharing, sort of targeted training for jobs that might be or they are being required within the public sector, no? Or is it just more sort of getting your own house in order and hoping that people with disabilities, thanks to that, will see the public service in Canada as an employer of choice and will then move to you? I'm getting now a first question, but over to you, Yazmine, to answer that, and then I'll come back with the first question.
For every employer. As I mentioned, our rate right now of self-identification, our representation rate is about 5.2%. But when we look at the results of our public service employee survey, our annual engagement survey, the response rate of people who self-identify is about 7%. So right there, you see that there's a gap. And so we believe that we do have higher representation rates than from our official data. And you're right, the question is, how do you encourage people to self-identify? My colleague, who is the Chief Human Resources Officer for the Government of Canada, is actually launching a completely new approach and a campaign around self-identification to try and destigmatize it, because right now in Canada, we have an Employment Equity Act that describes 4 groups, disadvantaged groups, and federally regulated employers have to report on how well they're doing in employing those 4 groups. But as we know, identity is way more diverse and complex than 4 groups. And so my colleague is developing a campaign that's going to focus on kind of taking pride in your multiple identities and removing the idea that it's an obligation because I'm required because there's a law, to how do I reaffirm who I am, and how do I take pride in in all of my identities. So they're still in the design phase, but they are hoping to launch later this year. And I'll be happy to come back and share more when we have more information on that. With respect to the pipeline, you know, it's interesting when you look. So we do a lot of student hiring in the Government of Canada, and last year we had 1,600 students who self-identified with a disability, but we only hired 100. So I'm not sure that we have a supply issue necessarily. We've got to figure out what's going on the demand side. I'm really intrigued by this Cisco program because we have the same issue in terms of data scientists, cybersecurity, and in fact, I'm talking to my colleague, the Chief Information Officer for the Government of Canada, to talk about what more should we be doing. And so I love the idea of the Cisco program, and I'm going to actually pursue that with my colleague. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Yazmine. Questions are coming in, and I think they're both relevant for both of you. So first question comes from Shirin from UNICEF, who's basically asking whether you've been very honest about the staff engagement and this sort of more people with disabilities leaving than entering. So the question is around, what have you identified what are the main reasons for people with disabilities sort of not being satisfied, and sometimes because of that leaving the public service? I think that question is mainly for you, Yazmine, and then I'll take some other questions which are also relevant for Victor.
That is a great question, and I wish I had a great answer for you, but I don't, because we don't do exit interviews systematically. So we know, we know one of the drivers for people leaving the workplace, and that's retirement. So our representation rates, we believe, are actually driven by the fact that people tend to spend their entire careers in the public service. And so people will age into disability. And that's the reason why we're at above 5% in terms of self-reporting. And so we're getting to, you know, baby boomers are all retiring. And so there is a disproportionately high level of people who've self-identified who are leaving as a result of retirement. But we also know anecdotally, a little bit more anecdotally, that people who go on medical leave, so if you've been waiting for 2 years to get the accommodation that you need, you may end up going on long-term medical leave. And what we do know is that people who go on long-term medical leave, they very rarely return to the workplace. So again, I don't have a statistically significant source of data, but we know anecdotally that that's one of the drivers. And we also know that people often leave within the first 2 years of employment. And that is often related to the fact that they do not feel included and welcome in the workplace. And I think we can directly link that back to accommodations. So thank you for the question.
Yes, so we've noticed that it's a couple of different things, right? Or in conjunction with each other. Is number one, self-disclosing your disability, because a lot of people don't want to self-disclose their disability and they can't get the accommodation, and that moves them to leave because they are scared for lots of reasons, right? Discrimination in the workplace, which Yazmine mentioned earlier, the stigma around some disabilities, unfortunately. So that's one. And then we've certainly seen that people ask for accommodations, people don't know how to deliver those accommodations. And if they don't get them, the alternatives, they can't deal with it anymore and they leave. Those are the things that we've noticed.
Thank you, Victor. One question which I think is also particularly relevant for our New York colleagues is about difference between the public and the private sector. I mean, you are both promoting the employment within the public sector, but also working very closely with the private sector. No? So the question is a bit about, do you see major differences between promoting employment in those two sectors? What would be your answer to that?
So this is Martha, and I thank you for the question. And I'll be totally honest, neither the commissioner nor I thought the city would be taking the lead like it has. We really felt we had a very strong business development council, that most of the opportunities would come from these, these high growth areas. But when we figured out how to address something that existed in the city, that had existed for a long time, but no one could really quite maneuver it or navigate it, and this is, I think, what happens oftentimes, is that the institutional memory of what something was how something was supposed to operate gets lost. And we found that there were people who had working for the city for many years in HR that had no idea what 55A was. So when you're able, and I can take this example and take it to like a healthcare corporation or one of our retail partners, because it's the same concept. We really don't come in as the experts. We come in and say, what are the issues that you're facing? You know, we always offer that disability etiquette and awareness training no matter what, but then we work with them to really design how do you want to start making change in your organization? Because it's not just about employment, it's about changing culture. It's about having a more open and respectful environment for people. And if they don't know what to expect because they've not ever been exposed to disability, things will never change. So we take an approach which is really, let us talk to you and listen to you about what it is you'd like to see happen, and we will work with you and your staff to create that opportunity. Sometimes it just starts with an internship. If a company doesn't have an internship program and they like to start doing something, we can work with them to be able to create an internship. And I think there's a question about that as well, as how do we get things paid, right?
Yeah, as far as how do we make sure that funding for internships for people with disabilities are there? We, the City of New York, don't particularly fund internships, but what we do is we encourage our people that we're working with to provide them, funding to make sure that they get paid, and then we access state dollars that get people paid internships as well. And in the City of New York, we no longer have free internships. We pay everyone that comes in, regardless of disability or not.
Thank you to both. Yazmine, two questions over to you. You might have seen them, but I'll rephrase them a bit. One is a follow-up question to your points about self-identification, which is, would people need to prove their disability, especially in case of invisible disabilities like mental health? And second question, and you spoke about this when you came to Geneva, I know that you have in the public service in Canada, you also have an employee resource group or several. It would be nice to hear a bit about that. So over to you.
Thank you. That self-identification question is a really good one. So the passport idea that we're trying to implement is to try and move away from the medical model and focus on the barriers as opposed to the condition. But I know that the reality today in the public service is not that. So we've just done a benchmarking survey to understand better the state of workplace accommodations. And we heard back from 5,400 public servants, both employees who sought an accommodation and supervisors who had been asked for one. And what we heard was a lot of frustration about repeatedly being asked to provide medical proof. Even if, for example, a student had already received an accommodation in university and they were coming in, and why can't you just accept the proof that I got this accommodation at university? Why do I have to go through the whole process again? It's very uneven. The way our policies are currently written, a medical certificate is not required, but it may be asked if, let's say that there's a real challenge in terms of understanding what the best accommodation would be. So you might need to turn to some kind of expert support to advise the manager, the hiring manager, on actually what are the kinds of accommodations needed. when you enter, so when I came into the public service of Canada and I was applying for my first job, I just ticked the box. Nobody asked me for proof. I just ticked the box, and that's what I did. So it varies. It varies on whether you're just applying for a job or whether you're actually applying for an accommodation. So that would be the distinction that I would draw. With respect to employee networks, we have a pretty vibrant employee group. And every department in the government, so whether it's Health Canada, Environment Canada, Transport Canada, these are big organizations. They have their own internal employee networks of people with disabilities. Usually they're chaired by somebody with a disability. And then the head of the organization will usually appoint a champion who's there to provide support and sponsorship for the employee groups. And we encourage employee groups to work with each other, so across the various departments, but also across the various employee networks. We think it's really important that employee networks be able to support one another because, you know, they're often seeking similar solutions or dealing with similar problems, and we think it's really important that there be collaboration. So we have a very robust set of employee networks in the Government of Canada, which is a really good thing.
Thank you, Yazmine, for that. We are moving towards the end of the webinar. We have had about 70 participants. I think we all have stayed until the end, so I think you definitely have said things which have been of great interest. Probably, I would like you both to make some sort of final message to our participants. Perhaps, Victor, Martha, it's about what would be your recommendation to other cities to sort of start something like you're doing, which seems to be pretty unique. And Yazmine, also a bit, what would be a message from you to another government, sort of on where to start, perhaps? I think this is always, I think we need to start from somewhere. I think it's good to have that advice. So first over to our colleagues in New York, and then over to you, Yazmine.
I think I'm still on mute. There we go. Hello. Thank you, Esteban. I think it's a lot of different things. It's number one, making sure that you're positioned highly enough to be able to make that effective change. We are out of the mayor's office, so we have a lot of persuasion, I like to say, to be able to do that and be able to work across city agencies to ensure that everything you're doing is accessible for people with disabilities. It's got to be a broad scope, and you can't say no. You got to be able to drive it. You got to be powerful. You have to be, in a way, creative, looking at existing programs and services, and how do you ensure that you tailor them to be accessible in the greatest way possible. Martha, anything to add to that?
I think the education piece is really crucial. Again, people don't know what they don't know, and being able to have disability awareness training, etiquette training, talking about reasonable accommodation in an atmosphere that is respectful. And I think that's really where conversations start, because again, it's not just about employment. We really are looking to change culture as part of our work here. But thank you very much for the opportunity to share this morning with you.
Thank you to both of you. Yazmine, over to you.
So I'll just pick up a bit on what Victor said. Leadership is critically important. You need people at the top of your organization to be committed to this, because without that, you're not going to get the legitimacy that you need. But the second, and what is really important, is the nothing without us principle. You have to engage people with lived experience. Do not assume that you know and that you have the answers. You need to listen. We spent our first 6 months in listening mode, and that's what informed our process. You need to engage with people with lived experience who will tell you very candidly what you can do better and what their priorities for action are. And I guess the final thing I would say is don't be afraid. You have to start somewhere. You will make mistakes. As long as you're honest about what your intention is and what you're trying to achieve, that will go a really long way. But don't let fear get in the way of moving forward. And again, thank you to Stefan and the ILO for organizing this. I'm so excited, and thank you, Victor and Martha. I learn from you every time.
Same here. Thank you.
Thank you to the three of you. Really, you've made this a very impressive webinar. Thanks, Yazmine. Thanks, Martha. Thanks, Victor. Again, it was great to have you here with us in Geneva. It was great to do the webinar. We're going to do a second webinar also on public sector employment. So we will inform everybody who has registered for this webinar. Thank you for those of you who asked questions. There are a few which we didn't answer fully, but we have noted them and we'll come back to you over email if that is okay. We have recorded the webinar and we'll be sharing that record in a few days. And we're also going to share with all registered participants a background paper, a draft paper, which we have prepared as ILO on the employment of persons with disabilities in the public sector. And we would definitely like to have feedback from participants in terms of content that is missing, content that needs to be changed, examples of good practice which we have not been able to identify. So thank you again to the speakers in particular, but also to the almost 70 participants that have been joining us online, and as I said, another 110 had registered, and will also be able to see the record. We will also put this this webinar on our website so that people can look at it at a later stage. So again, thank you to all of you, and have a good rest of the day.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.